following 20 minutes, I will try to introduce you the general topic that we are going to be discussing about in a more detailed way, thanks to our fantastic panelists. So let's dive deep into outer space. So first of all, I was wondering what are the current developments in outer space and what their most important legal challenges which they are presenting. So first of all, recently we heard that there are 2 astronauts who accidentally stuck in outer space, and they are going to be staying here in the International Space Station until 2025 February. And also in the last few days we had the first private spacewalk. Of course, we are having discussions about space tourism, and as we can see, the private enterprises are participating more and more in outer space activities, which are having a lot of legal issues. Secondly, we know that space is infinite. However, its resources, and especially Earth's orbit, is not, which are having a lot of legal challenges. The European Union is also trying to establish their legal framework. However, recently we had a real legal case when the United States family sued NASA because a small part of International Space Station destroyed their home. Thirdly, we have militarization in outer space. Recently, Donald Trump was also saying in one of his speeches that he wants to establish a Space National Guard if he gets re-elected. So we can see that space is getting more and more tensions. Fourthly, we have a lot of space resource activities, or at least we are planning to have space resource activities. I don't want to spoil anything, but I think Güneş is going to be mentioning a little bit about this topic. And fifthly, we have a lot of regional space blocks. For example, the already mentioned Artemis Accords, the International Lunar Research Station. I think it's going to be addressed by our Nigerian panelist, Nariana Naburka, so I'm not going to be talking too much about this, but we have to see that outer space is becoming more and more crowded, and it has a lot of legal challenges. And I've tried to identify the 3 most important questions which are going to be making up the structure of my presentation. So I'm trying to search for the answers to these 3 questions. So first of all, what role legal rules really playing in this highly politicized international area? Secondly, why should we care about this issue? I mean, in Hungary, for example, why should I care about it as a lawyer? And thirdly, how could law secure the interest of smaller nations and solve these challenges? So first of all, what role legal rules really play in this area? To understand this, we have to go back to the history of the establishment of outer space, because we have to understand why nations are signing up for international treaties. And in the classical period, we can say that outer space was mainly about 2 things, and only 2 nations were participating, United States and Russia, and they were concerned about exploration and militarization. And they tried to stop the isolation of the Cold War, so they signed the most important legally binding treaty, the Outer Space Treaty. However, in the 70s and 80s, I'm calling this period as the time of cooperation, when a lot of developing countries realized that they also want to participate in the formation of an international framework, especially in outer space. So within the United Nations framework, they started an initiative called the New International Economic Order, which was aiming for fair research sharing, preferential treatment, preventing research exploitation, and these principles are mainly reflected in the Moon Agreement, which some of the experts called it as a failed treaty. However, this also shows that whenever developing countries are together, they could establish some kind of change in international sphere. Of course, after the post-Cold War, the rise of commercial sector started, and we have a lot of new technologies, for example, television broadcasting, remote sensing, nuclear power uses. So in the modern age, we have a lot of national laws, we have a lot of regional space blocks, and most importantly, outer space is not about exploration, but about the use of potential benefits. So as a consequence, or as a conclusion to my question, what role legal rules really play in this area, I would say that it's essential for reducing rivalry. It's a framework which has to manage tensions, and it creates forcibility, which is it's extremely important for the commercial sector, and it's also a tool for securing the interest of all nations. And this could only be achieved by balancing the needs between the spacefaring countries and the least developed ones. So second question, why should we prioritize these complex legal debates about outer space, or why does it concern us? The answer is pretty easy, because we could say that space is fundamentally a public good, and it inherently means that it has the ability to be used by many people simultaneously without diminishing their availability or increasing the associated costs. And of course, as I've already mentioned, space is infinite, however its resources are limited, and space serves as a crucial platform for public infrastructure. Just think about the International Space Station. And the problem is that only a few technologically advanced nations can actively participate in space activities. However, we have a lot of developing countries who lack these technologies to do so. So only international law can prevent the abuse and ensure fairness, and to safeguard outer space resources and serve the interest of all nations. And as Hungarian, I have to mention that in the basic law, we know that we have rights on one hand, and on the other hand, we will have responsibilities or obligations. And the golden rule in outer space is that everything is free. So the exploration and use is free. However, we have special responsibilities and obligations. And so, for example, it must be peaceful, we have to share benefits, we have to preserve space environment. However, we have one particular principle in the Outer Space Treaty, which says that it's a province of all mankind, which is usually interpreted as an obligation to leave outer space in a condition which can be used for benefit and enjoyment of the future generations. And as a Hungarian, in our fundamental law, we are saying that we bear responsibility for our descendants, therefore we shall protect the living conditions of future generation. So as Hungarians, we have a special legal obligation to participate in any activity which could serve the future generations. So I also must highlight this fact, but of course these principles could be interpreted differently. So again, we have tension between small countries and more developed ones. Thirdly, could international law secure the interest of smaller nations and solve all the challenges? It's quite an interesting question, because it's very easy to identify the most important spacefaring nations. They usually having an established contemporary presence in outer space. However, who are the other nations? Are these developing countries? Are these emerging space nations? Because we know that 1/3 of all nations are participating in certain space activities. So we must identify the other parties. And for this, we have research by the European Space Policy Institution, which says that any nation could be put on a so-called space power map, which will be deciding where we are standing on a global map based on our space capabilities and our space autonomy. So first of all, capacity refers to a nation's ability to implement strategies that fulfill its economic, political, and social objective. So it answers the question what they are doing in outer space, how advanced their technology is, for what they are using their technology, and how they are using the technology. However, on the other side, we have autonomy, which refers to a nation's ability to define and pursue its space-related interest independently. It could be technical or it could be political autonomy. So as we look at this space power map, in the upper right quadrant, we can identify the space powers, and on the opposite side, we can identify this limited space nations, However, everything which is between these two limits can be called as emerging space nations. So, for example, if we have significant capacity but we have limited autonomy, we are being called spacefaring nations. But if we are having limited capacity but significant autonomy, we can be called as a rising space nation. So this is why I was trying to provide you with this questionnaire, because based on my questions, we can put each other's nation on this global space power map. And as an example, I'm trying to put Hungary on this space power map. So first of all, I will introduce you Hungary, or the Hungarian space sector, extremely briefly. First of all, the Kármán line, you probably heard about it, but it's the widely accepted boundary of outer space, and it's named after the Hungarian physicist. We have been the 7th nation who sent astronauts into outer space. I have to mention that Gyula Gál was one of the first space lawyers in the world, and he wrote this very interesting book before the moon landing, and it's actually very modern. I'm recommending this to all of you who are interested in outer space. I think it's also in English. And I recently found out that when the nations were negotiating the liability convention, there was a Hungarian draft treaty. And since we've been in the Soviet Union, we've been really opting for the communist perspective of law. However, I think it's a very interesting reading, so if you're having time, I'm also recommending you this. And of course, Hungary ratified the 4 of the main treaties, and Hungary has been one of the founding members of the UNOSA. And currently, Hungary is trying to establish contemporary presence in outer space. We have the first Hungarian space strategy, which is having its main flagship project called HONOR program. So we are sending an astronaut to the International Space Station soon. We are also establishing our legal framework. We recently joined to the European Interparliamentary Space Conference. We are also having a working group within the Hungarian Parliament, and institutionally it belongs to the Department for Space Activities of the Hungarian Ministry of Foreign Affairs under the Ministerial Commissioner for Space Activities, who's sitting next to me, and it's an honor. So this is the de facto space agency of Hungary. So as a conclusion, if I would have to put Hungary on the space power map, I would say that Hungary shows more growth in capacity thanks to international cooperation and project participation than in autonomy, because our autonomy still depends on external partners. However, I must highlight the fact that autonomy can be quickly achieved by, for example, establishing a legal framework or political strategy, which we are doing. So hopefully soon we are going to be emerging. As a consequence, I must highlight the fact that since countries are rapidly transitioning into emerging spacefaring nations, the term developing countries is less relevant in the context of space activities. And I also must highlight the fact that based on the space power map, there are certain countries which have inherently advanced, because, for example, they are closer to the equator. And for example, we are calling India as a developing country. However, they're in the they are in the top 5 space nations in the world. And I also want to show you an example what the collaboration of developing countries could do. We all know what geostationary orbits are. These are limited resources, and these are crucial for satellite operation. However, in 1979, some equatorial countries came together, and they said that since they are closer to the equator, it's part of their sovereign territory, which is a clear violation of the non-appropriation principle of the Outer Space Treaty. However, they were saying that since there's no clear legal definition of outer space, they can declare this. This was being called the Bogota Declaration, and this brought global attention for the fair distribution of limited resources, which had an influence on the development of the International Telecommunication Union's constitution. But maybe Rosa will be mentioning this in more detail. I don't know. Yes, okay, so you're going to. So, as a conclusion, could international law secure the interest of smaller nations and solve challenges? If our answer is yes, then we still have to decide how, because I don't think that something like the Bogota Declaration would be a good answer to this. However, if we are saying that international law cannot secure the interest of smaller nations, then we are implying that the treaties are lacking strong institutional foundation. And since it is working on a consensus rule, it's incapable of establishing anything else than soft law. And since treaties are only binding nations and not private entities, the only solution would be to establish a domestic regulation. And I would say that both answers are pointing at the same direction, because if we are saying that international law can secure the interests of smaller nations, that the mode is to be using the domestic laws. And if we're saying no, then it also points to the domestic law. So, so as a conclusion, domestic space legislation can significantly enhance a nation's space sector, which means that any nation could be a leader in space legislation, and it plays a crucial role in addressing the key challenges I was mentioning in the beginning of my presentation. However, Russia, for example, I'm quoting that they are saying that national space legislation is disregarding the history of the talks within the framework of the United Nations, and it's a disrespect for the international law and order. However, I must highlight the fact that international law was developed from national law. So national space legislation could be viewed as the completion and continuation of the international legal framework. And we have a lot of very impressive examples. For example, Luxembourg's national space law is something which could be a role model for any nation. So as a conclusion, the role of emerging space nations in space legislation is to actively engage in standard setting. Why? Because it's a responsibility and an obligation, and it's the interest of humanity and the future generation. And how? I would say that through national legislation and cooperation, which inherently ends up in the development of international law. So with this, I'm thanking you your attention, and I'm giving back the floor to Moshe. Thank you.